Is it possible that the greatest legacies aren't carved in stone, but are sown in silence? Is it possible that true strength isn't found in the clash of swords, but in the quiet resolve of a gentle spirit, in a faith that endures the tests of time? Today, our channel invites you on a journey. This isn't a story of conquering kings or prophets who command the elements. This is the story of a seemingly quieter man, a man whose name means laughter, yet whose life would navigate the deepest, most somber notes of sacrifice, of waiting, and of family conflicts that seemed impossible to heal. This is the story of Isaac, the son of the promise, the father of two rival nations, and a living testament to how trusting God sometimes means letting go of all control only to find the greatest peace. Stay with us until the end of this story, because its conclusion will reveal a surprising truth about the nature of blessings and about how sacred promises, though mysterious, never, ever fail. And before we begin, could you let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you? Leave a comment below. We'd love to say hello. Our story begins under the blistering sun of the desert, where dust and time had etched deep lines onto the faces of Abraham and Sarah. They were a couple who had walked the earth for nearly a century, a marriage where the hope for a child had withered and died like a branch in the wilderness. Sarah's heart had grown hard, calloused by decades of hopeless waiting, by the deafening silence in their tent. Then one day, as Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent, God himself appeared, and an impossible promise was spoken, a promise that Sarah, at 90 years old, would bear a son. Hearing this from inside the tent, a laugh escaped Sarah's lips. But it wasn't the laugh of joy, it was the laugh of cynical disbelief, a bitter sound that carried the weight of decades of disappointment. How could it be? Her body was old, and all hope had faded long ago. But Abraham was different. He didn't laugh. His heart was anchored by a quiet faith that no one could understand, a certainty that grew stronger each day as he gazed up at the star-filled night sky. He remembered the sacred covenant, that his descendants would be as numerous as those glittering lights, spread endlessly across the desert canopy. And he believed. Time passed, and the promise seemed to fade into a distant myth, until one day the news arrived. It swept through the camp like a sudden wind, stirring everything. Sarah was with child. Each day her belly grew, and with it the astonishment, the anxiety, and the reverence of the entire household. Abraham watched his wife. He saw her smile in a way he never imagined he would see again. It was a smile cleared of all bitterness, as pure and radiant as the dawn after a long, dark night. And then the moment came. Amidst breaths and prayers, a tiny life cried out for the first time. The child was named Isaac, a name that means laughter. But this time, it wasn't the laughter of disbelief. It was the laughter of pure joy, of the miracle God had planted among them. Isaac grew up, enveloped in special care and protection. There was a sense of divine purpose that surrounded the boy, something no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. Every day, Abraham looked at his son and felt the weight of the responsibility this promise demanded. To him, Isaac was more than just a son. He was a living sign, tangible proof of God's faithfulness. From a young age, Isaac felt the weight of this invisible promise hanging over his life. He didn't truly understand what it meant, but his father, Abraham, spoke to him often of the covenant with God, of the stars in the sky that would one day represent his descendants. Isaac listened intently, impressed, but still far from grasping what all of this would require of him. Their home was marked by faith, but it was not without human complexity. Isaac grew up alongside his mother, Sarah, and his older half-brother, Ishmael. At first, things seemed peaceful, but as the boys grew, a subtle rivalry began to brew. Sarah, with a mother's intuition, noticed it. She saw it in the way they played. She felt the underlying tension, and a fear began to sprout in her heart. She was afraid that Ishmael, the son of her handmaiden Hagar, might negatively influence the path of Isaac, the chosen one. That fear grew into a fierce resolve. She persuaded, even pleaded with Abraham to send Hagar and her son away. It was a heart-wrenching decision that tore Abraham apart. Isaac, just a boy, watched with sadness as his brother left. He didn't fully understand the reasons, but the image of Ishmael and his mother disappearing behind the dunes became an indelible mark on his memory. It was the first sign that his path would be different, a path that would sometimes be lonely, marked by an invisible responsibility he was only just beginning to feel. After Ishmael's departure, life went on. Isaac once again became the center of all care from Sarah and Abraham, but there was a constant expectation in the air, something only Abraham and Sarah knew but never spoke of. Isaac, for his part, felt a growing curiosity about this special purpose that everyone seemed to see in him. He had no idea that soon his own faith and courage would be tested in a way no child could ever imagine. The sky was just beginning to lighten when Abraham called for Isaac. He told him they were going on a long journey to Mount Moriah. To the young man, the trip seemed ordinary. He had accompanied his father many times for sacrifices, solemn moments when Abraham would build an altar and offer animals to God. But that morning, something was different. His father's face, a face he revered, was heavier, as if he were carrying a secret so painful he couldn't share it. With an axe in his hand and the wood for the altar on his shoulders, Isaac walked beside Abraham. The further they went, the thicker the silence between them became. The vast, empty landscape of the mountains only seemed to amplify the terrifying quiet between father and son. When they had traveled a good distance, Isaac looked around and realized something was missing, something essential for the ritual, the sacrificial animal. He hesitated for a moment, perhaps not wanting to disturb his father's deep thoughts. But curiosity and the strange circumstances pushed him. Finally he spoke, his clear voice echoing in the still air. "Father, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham turned, and with a distant look in his eyes, he answered mysteriously, "My son, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." Isaac, though still confused, nodded. He trusted his father's words, even as a strange unease began to creep in, filling his heart. Finally, they reached the summit of the mountain. Abraham began to prepare the altar, arranging the wood carefully and slowly. Then, in a voice that was barely able to remain steady, he called to Isaac. He told him to lie on the altar. He bound him on top of the very wood that Isaac himself had carried. Isaac was confused and terrified. His mind raced with 1,000 unanswerable questions, but he obeyed. Perhaps out of the immense love and respect he had for his father, perhaps out of an inexplicable trust he felt even in this horrifying moment. He lay still, feeling the ropes tighten, and then he saw his father raise the knife. The early morning light glinted off the sharp blade. Isaac squeezed his eyes shut, feeling an agony run through his soul, bracing for the inevitable. Abraham's own heart was breaking, tears streaming down his cheeks. But just before the blade could touch his son, a powerful voice thundered across the mountain, calling Abraham's name. The knife stopped, suspended in midair. Abraham took a deep, shuddering breath as an overwhelming sense of relief flooded his chest. The voice of God had called to him, had interrupted the sacrifice. God told him that his faith had been tested, and there was no need to sacrifice his only son. Isaac, still lying on the altar, slowly opened his eyes. He was dazed and saw his father weeping. Abraham scrambled to untie the ropes with trembling hands. Father and son looked at each other, and in that moment, Isaac realized that his life was not merely his own. He was part of something larger, a purpose he could not yet fully comprehend. They descended the mountain together, but the silence between them was different now. It was no longer heavy with a secret, but filled with awe. Isaac felt a mixture of respect, fear, and admiration for his father, who had been willing to do the unthinkable in the name of his faith. Though questions still echoed in his mind, he kept them to himself, accepting that some answers would, for now, remain a mystery. Isaac's life was about to change again. Sometime later, his mother, Sarah, fell ill. Her health began to decline steadily. Isaac, with his deep, watchful eyes, quietly observed his mother growing weaker. He was becoming more and more aware that her time was running out. He remembered his moments with Sarah, the stories she told him, and the protective love she had always given him. The day she died, her absence left a vast emptiness in Isaac's heart, a void he didn't know how to fill. The full weight of adulthood crashed down on him, along with the duty to continue Abraham's lineage. The grief from his mother's funeral was still fresh when Isaac found himself facing a new reality. His father, now old and frail, began to speak of the importance of finding him a wife. Isaac, still lost in his grief, wasn't thinking of marriage. But Abraham knew that God's promise could not be fulfilled unless Isaac continued the family line. With a final act of determination, Abraham called his most faithful servant and sent him on a special mission to travel to their ancestral land and find a wife for the son of the promise. Isaac watched the servant depart, not knowing what to expect. The days passed and he carried on with his duties, but his heart was restless. He knew something important was about to happen. One evening, as he was walking through the fields at twilight, in a moment of quiet reflection, it was as if he could see beyond what his eyes could perceive on the horizon. Alone with his thoughts, he truly understood the weight of the responsibility God's promise had placed upon him. It was then that he saw it in the distance, a caravan approaching. Isaac's heart began to beat faster, though he didn't know why. As the caravan drew near, he could see a young woman, her face veiled, riding a camel. She was looking at him with curiosity. As she dismounted, he noticed that her eyes shone, reflecting a mix of excitement and charm. This was Rebekah, the woman chosen to be his wife. They didn't exchange many words, but they both felt something special connecting them. There was a lightness in her presence that brought comfort to Isaac's grieving heart, a warmth he hadn't felt since he lost his mother, Sarah. Rebekah was unlike anyone he had ever known. She was brave, kind, and willing to embark on a journey of faith, just like the one he had inherited from Abraham. Their marriage was sealed quickly, as if they both knew this meeting was no coincidence. With Rebekah by his side, Isaac began to see that his path, though still filled with profound challenges, was one he would no longer have to face alone. The first years of their marriage were sweet. Rebekah brought joy and stability to Isaac's life. He found in her a friend, a confidant, and a woman of faith who shared his mission. Together they shared their dreams, the small moments of daily life, always aware of the greater calling that united them. But as time passed, a familiar silence began to grow in their home. The days and nights grew longer. Rebekah could not conceive. With each new year that passed without a child, their concern grew. Isaac felt the weight of his legacy pressing down on him more heavily than ever. He knew he was the heir to a great promise, but how could that promise be fulfilled if he had no children to carry it on? As the anxiety became a shadow in their home, Isaac turned to God. He spent hours in prayer, pleading for a miracle, searching for answers and strength. He remembered the sacrifice on Mount Moriah and how God had been faithful in every moment of his life. Rebekah, though also disappointed, shared the same faith and hope. Deep down, she knew their desire for a child wasn't just their own. It was for an entire nation that would one day emerge from their family. And then, after 20 long years, when the weight seemed unbearable, the news finally came. Rebekah was pregnant. Joy flooded their home, but this would be no ordinary pregnancy. Rebekah soon noticed something strange inside her. There was a constant struggle within her womb, as if the children were fighting for space and power even before they were born. Troubled and intrigued, she prayed, trying to understand what was happening. It was then that God spoke to her, revealing that two nations were in her womb, and the older would serve the younger. This message brought a mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew this would change the course of their family forever. With a heart torn between mystery and promise, Isaac and Rebekah awaited the birth of their children, never imagining the conflicts that were to come and how their faith would be put to the test once more. Finally, the day of birth arrived. The twins were born, and from the very first moment, Isaac and Rebekah saw the stark differences in their sons. The first to emerge was Esau, his skin reddish, his whole body covered in hair, looking strong and wild. Immediately after, Jacob was born, more serene, but his hand was grasping his brother's heel, as if demonstrating a cunning will to never be second, even from birth. As the years went by, the boys' personalities only amplified these initial differences. Esau grew up free and untamed. He was a skilled hunter who spent hours in the fields, far from home. He was a man of action, of impulsive feelings. Jacob, in contrast, preferred to stay closer to the tents. He was quiet, careful, and observant, spending much of his time with his mother, Rebekah, learning the ways of the household. This division wasn't just about personality. It created a subtle but powerful rift in the family. Isaac felt a special affection for Esau. He admired his son's strength, courage, and adventurous spirit. In Esau, he saw an extension of his own youth and vitality. Rebekah, in turn, favored Jacob. She found in her younger son a quietness and intelligence that resonated with her own soul. This parental favoritism, though unspoken, sowed the seeds of a deep rivalry between the brothers. It was something Isaac seemed to ignore, perhaps because he believed God's choice was set in stone, and Esau, as the firstborn, was the rightful heir. As Esau and Jacob grew, they didn't just compete. They nurtured a resentment that each disguised in his own way. Esau looked down on Jacob's quiet nature, while Jacob envied Esau's position as the firstborn. One day, Esau returned from a long hunt, exhausted and starving. He found Jacob preparing a steaming, fragrant pot of lentil stew. Fatigue and hunger dominated Esau's senses. Without thinking, he demanded some food from his brother. Jacob, ever the calculator, saw his chance. He made a proposal. He would give Esau the stew, but in exchange, Esau had to give up his birthright. Esau, driven by the impulsiveness of the moment, laughed and accepted. He despised his birthright, thinking it worthless compared to the gnawing hunger he felt. He traded his inheritance for a single plate of stew. When Isaac found out about this exchange, he didn't take it seriously. He considered it nothing more than a joke between brothers, and he continued to see Esau as his rightful heir, never imagining that this thoughtless trade would lead to much greater consequences and that the fate of his family was about to take an unexpected turn. Years passed, and the deal between Esau and Jacob seemed like a distant memory. But for Jacob, it wasn't just an exchange. It was a silent promise, a first step in his belief that one day he would inherit the blessing and favor of God, regardless of being the younger son. Isaac was now old, his eyes weak and nearly blind. He knew that soon he would have to pass on the blessing of the inheritance. He decided it was time to bless Esau. He called his firstborn son and told him, "Go out to the field and hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Esau, honored and excited, left immediately, unaware that his mother, Rebekah, had overheard the conversation, and she intended to intervene. She had never forgotten what God had revealed to her during her pregnancy, that the older would serve the younger. Rebekah quickly called Jacob and told him about his father's plan. She instructed him to disguise himself as Esau. She took Esau's best clothes for Jacob to wear, and she covered his smooth hands, arms, and neck with goatskins to imitate his brother's hairy skin. Jacob hesitated at first, afraid his father would discover the deception and curse him instead of blessing him. But Rebekah assured him, saying any curse would fall on her. Following his mother's directions, Jacob prepared a delicious meal and went into Isaac's tent. He said in a voice he tried to make sound confident, "My father, it is I." Isaac was confused. He said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He asked Jacob to come closer. He felt his son's arms and felt the roughness of the goatskins. Deceived by touch and by the scent of Esau on the clothes, he was convinced. He ate the meal Jacob served him. After he finished, he placed his hands on Jacob's head and gave him the blessing. A powerful blessing that would ensure leadership, prosperity, and the continuation of God's promise. Just as Jacob was leaving the tent, Esau returned from his hunt. With a proud look on his face, he presented the meal he had prepared for his father, certain that he would soon receive the blessing of the inheritance. But when Isaac heard Esau's voice, he trembled with confusion and horror. It took him a moment to understand that something terrible had happened. "Who are you?" Isaac asked, his voice frail. Esau replied, "It is I, your son, your firstborn, Esau." Isaac was in shock. He realized his mistake. The blessing could not be revoked. It had been given to Jacob. Esau, realizing his brother had deceived him, let out a loud and bitter cry of anguish. He begged his father for a blessing as well. Isaac, devastated, mumbled some words of consolation, but he could not undo what he had done. "Your brother came deceitfully," he said, in a sad tone Esau had never heard before. "Jacob has stolen your blessing." That day, Esau's hatred for Jacob was sealed into a promise of revenge. He vowed to kill Jacob after their father died. The peace in Isaac's family was shattered. He watched with immense regret as the bonds between his sons were corrupted, and he feared this hatred would lead to irreversible tragedy. It was then that Rebekah, sensing the looming danger, secretly called Jacob and advised him to flee to the land of her brother Laban until Esau's anger subsided. Before he left, Jacob went to see Isaac, and Isaac, despite everything that had happened, blessed him once again, recognizing that God had a special purpose for him. The father watched his son depart with a mixture of sadness and hope, understanding that Jacob's path would be lonely and full of trials. As he watched Jacob leave, Isaac felt the weight of the farewell and a silent pain that constricted his chest. His tent felt empty. He spent his long days in silence, reflecting on the choices and mysteries surrounding his family. All that was left for him now in his old age was to face the loneliness and the consequences of a blessing that had forever changed the destiny of his sons. With Jacob in exile and Esau consumed by grief and resentment, Isaac decided to leave his familiar surroundings. He moved his family to the land of Gerar, where the Philistines lived. This change was more than just geographical. Isaac was trying to find peace in a place free from the painful daily reminders of the conflict between his sons. Life in Gerar seemed promising at first, but soon Isaac faced new hardships. A famine struck the land, and finding water became a constant challenge. In his search for sustenance for his large family and flocks, Isaac began to re-dig the wells his father, Abraham, had dug long ago. These were wells the Philistines had jealously filled in. Each well he reopened was a small victory, a step toward keeping his family and servants safe and supplied. But every time he found water, the Philistine herdsmen would come to claim it, saying the land and the water belonged to them. But Isaac, with his patience and peaceful temperament, did not seek conflict. Whenever he was forced to abandon a well, he would simply move on and dig another. He was steadfast in his decision to avoid fights. This cycle of digging and abandoning wells seemed endless. But Isaac persisted, believing that at some point he would find a safe place where his family could finally prosper without dispute. After digging yet another well in a more distant valley, Isaac finally found peace. The Philistines didn't follow him this time. He named that well Rehoboth, which means spacious place, because he felt that God had finally given him and his family a space where they could live in peace. It was a small, quiet victory, but one that brought him renewed hope. It was at that moment, as news of his prosperity spread, that Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, came to him. Standing before King Abimelech, Isaac remained calm. Abimelech's offer of peace surprised him. As the king had previously watched with indifference Isaac's silent battles for the wells. But now the king saw something different. "We have seen clearly that the Lord is with you in everything you do," the king said, with genuine respect. Isaac listened intently to Abimelech's words, and a quiet relief took hold of his heart. He realized that his journey in Gerar, marked by patience and persistence, had won him not just land, but the respect of his former rivals. Isaac accepted the offer of peace and sealed the alliance with a meal. They sat together side by side like friends. As they talked, Isaac felt that this truce represented more than just an agreement. It was a sign of God's blessing on his life, even after all the conflict. The peace they shared symbolized the rest he had so longed for, and Isaac understood that his quiet faithfulness and gentle spirit had been his greatest victory. That very night, Isaac's servants came with the news that they had dug a new well, and this time they had found abundant water. It was as if the heavens had opened a path for him, pouring down a blessing on the dry earth as a reward for his persistence. Isaac named that well Sheba, meaning oath, as a reminder of his covenant with Abimelech and God's provision in his moment of need. From that point on, Isaac lived a period of stability and growth. But even in the midst of this prosperity, he couldn't stop thinking about his distant sons. The wounds between Esau and Jacob remained open. In his final years, Isaac would look around his large encampment, a home to so many generations, and feel the weight of time. The blessing of God was still present in everything around him. His flocks grew, his crops were abundant, and his servants worked with dedication. But even surrounded by prosperity, he couldn't quell the unease that flowed through him whenever he thought of his children. Ever since Jacob had left home, Isaac felt as if something essential was missing. Esau, though he remained nearby, carried a bitterness that Isaac couldn't erase. He had built his life there, married women from neighboring villages, but the resentment and anger of the past were still visible in his eyes. Isaac tried to maintain peace with him, but he knew the chasm between the brothers was deep. Isaac often wondered if he would ever see them together again as a family. As his strength faded, Isaac allowed himself to trust that even if he wasn't a witness to the reunion of his sons, God's promise would be fulfilled in his own way. He believed that just as God had sustained him through every challenge, he would also guide the steps of Jacob and Esau, leading them toward the future that had been promised since the days of Abraham. And so it was, with a calm heart and his eyes fixed on the horizon, that Isaac rested, leaving behind a legacy of faith that would ripple through the generations. His legacy, woven into the paths of his sons, would endure, and the stories of his life would continue to inspire us, reminding us that God's promises remain even in the midst of life's struggles and uncertainties. The story of Isaac teaches us that true courage isn't always shown in grand feats or magnificent victories. Sometimes it lies in quiet persistence, in the will to keep going even when the paths seem uncertain. One of the greatest lessons Isaac leaves us is the value of waiting. He waited 20 long years for the blessing of a son with Rebekah, and though it seemed impossible, he believed the promise would be fulfilled. And throughout his journey, he faced hardships, like the conflicts with the Philistines and the rivalry of his own children, but he always chose the path of peace. His story reminds us that we are not always in control of the events around us, but we can always choose how we respond to them. In the end, he left a legacy based not on power, but on faithfulness, a legacy that was passed on to Jacob and through him to an entire nation. So the life of Isaac is a powerful reminder that God is faithful. He not only guides the steps of those who trust in him, but he keeps every single promise to the very end, no matter the distance in time or the seemingly insurmountable difficulties. Like Isaac, we are called to trust, because what God promises, he always fulfills. If the story of Isaac's quiet but powerful faith has touched your heart, and if you want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, please don't hesitate to show it with a like and share this video with your loved ones. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's continue to explore the deeper lessons from the Bible. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.